محمد رسول الله لا إله إلا الله علي ولي الله.
Some Sahaba that were problematic, that we can be critical of their actions. In fact, the Quran was critical of some of their actions. Our claim that the Sahaba are not all of one category is based on the Quran. The Quran praises and honors some of the Sahaba, and while the Quran criticizes the actions of some of the Sahaba. While firmly believing that the Quran does not contradict itself, the Quran cannot criticize and praise the same Sahaba for the same actions. We believe that the Quran is speaking of various groups of the Sahaba. They were not all on one level. Thus, we will examine verses that praise the Sahaba and prove that they are not addressing all of the Sahaba, but only some. And we will also examine the verses that are critical of the Sahaba. And I will begin with the critical verses. Why? Because in the previous session, the verses that praise the Sahaba were already discussed. And I will come back to them. But I shall begin first with the critical verses in the Quran regarding the Sahaba. For example, we see in the Quran that the Quran calls some of the Sahaba hypocrites. Some are called fasiq. In some verses, Allah warned some of the Sahaba of apostasy after the death of the Prophet. Others were exposed for verbally abusing the Prophet. Some accused the Prophet's wife of adultery. The Quran exposes them. Some raised their voice in the presence of the Prophet, giving suggestions and giving opinions in the presence of the Prophet, when not asked. In Surah Al-Jumu'ah, Allah criticizes some of the Sahaba who left the Prophet whilst leading Friday prayer to perform business. وَإِذَا رَأُوا تِجَارَةً أَوْ لَهْوًا انْفَضُّوا إِلَيْهَا وَتَرَكُوكَ قَائِمًا. Al-Wahidi in Asbab Nuzul al-Ayat mentions that a group of Sahaba, while Rasulullah was performing Salat al-Jum'ah and reciting his sermon, a group of Sahaba, they heard a caravan of merchants, a caravan, they got up to perform business. In Surah Al-Hijr, the Quran exposes some of the Sahaba, and I will emphasize on the word some, not all. Just like the verses of praise are not to all of the Sahaba, nor were the verses of criticism. Some. Surah Al-Hijr exposes some of the Sahaba who would purposely come late to Salat al-Jama'ah due to the presence of a beautiful young lady. They would come late and stand in the final lines behind the woman to see the young lady. This is mentioned in Asbab al-Nuzul al-Wahidi. And the verse that exposes some of the Sahaba says, وَلَقَدْ عَلِمْنَا الْمُسْتَقْدِمِينَ مِنْكُمْ وَلَقَدْ عَلِمْنَا الْمُسْتَأْخِرِينَ. Al-Mustaqdimin were those that came early for Salat al-Jama'ah. They would stand in the first lines. Al-Mustakhirin were those that would come late and they would stand behind the females to see that young lady. This is mentioned by Al-Wahidi in Asbab al-Nuzul. Surah Al-Imran, verses 152 to 155 discuss the event of Uhud and what took place in Uhud. And we find critical verses of the Sahaba of what happened in Uhud. وَلَقَدْ صَدَقَكُمُ اللَّهُ وَعْدَهُ إِذْ تُحِسُّونَهُم بِإِذْنِهِ حَتَّى إِذَا فَشِلْتُمْ وَتَنَازَعْتُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ وَعَصَيْتُمْ مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا أَرَاكُمْ مَا تُحِبُّونَ مِنْكُمْ مَنْ يُرِيدُ الدُّنْيَا وَمِنْكُمْ مَنْ يُرِيدُ الْآخِرَةَ. The verses are telling us the story of Uhud when Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam ordered a group of Sahaba to stand on the hilltop and to wait for his orders and not to come down. While the Muslims that were on the battlefield, they engaged in a battle with the kuffar, and they found spoils of war. Their brothers standing on the hilltop, they also wanted some of the spoils of war. They were divided. Some said, let us come down. Others said, we cannot come down until Rasulullah authorizes us. The Quran tells us, حتى إذا فشلتم وتنازعتم, you argued, وعصيتم, and you disobeyed Rasulullah, because Rasulullah had told him not to come down until I tell you. Some of you want dunya. منكم من يريد الدنيا ومنكم من يريد الآخر. Some of you want this dunya. Others want akhir. Sahaba were not all the same. And then تصعدون ولا تلوون على أحد والرسول يدعوكم في أخراكم. And you turn your backs and you left the battleground while Rasulullah is calling you from behind you, calling you back to the battlefield. According to al-Qurtubi, in his tafsir, al-Jami' al-Ahkam al-Quran, a great deal of the Sahaba abandoned the battlefield.
Let me just stop you here. You mentioned al-Wahidi and al-Qurtubi. They are, this is very important, Sunni Mufassirin.
Yes, sir.
They are Sunnis.
Yes.
This is very important for mention.
I don't need
Thank
to
you.
mention a Shia Mufassir.
No, for the audience, not all of them are the scholars.
Al-Qurtubi and Wahidi. And by the way, I'm a big fan of Al-Qurtubi's tafsir. It is one of the best tafsir. And in my tafsir class, one of the tafsir that I rely on and depend on is tafsir al-Qurtubi. It's an amazing tafsir. This is the majority of the Sahaba. They left Rasulullah in the battlefield, and they were تصعدون ولا تلوون على أحد والرسول يدعوكم في أخراكم. And then Allah tells the Sahaba that He punished them. فأثابكم غما بغم. And He increased your sadness over sadness. لكي لا تحزنوا على ما فاتكم. طيب. In Surah Al-Hujurat, private chambers, we see critical verses of the Sahaba in which Allah states, يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تقدموا بين يدي الله ورسوله. O you who believe, do not advance not before God and His Messenger. By the way, on my translation, I depend on the study Quran by Sayyid Nasr. This is where I get my translation. O you who believe, do not raise your voices above the voice of the Prophet. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا ترفعوا أصواتكم فوق صوت النبي ولا تجهروا له بالقول. And do not speak to him the same way you speak to one another, lest your deeds come to naught. And تحبط أعمالكم. Your deeds will be withered, they will go away. Al-Qurtubi tells us sabab al-nuzul of this verse. He says that a caravan from Bani Tamim came to visit the Messenger of God. So Abu Bakr asked Al-Qa'qa' ibn Muhabbad to lead the delegation, while Umar ibn al-Khattab ordered Al-Aqra' ibn Habis to lead. Abu Bakr said to Umar, you only want to go against me. إِنَّمَا أَرَدْتَ خِلَافِي. While Umar replied, I did not. Their voices were raised high until Allah revealed these verses. يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لَا تَرْفَعُوا أَصْوَاتَكُمْ فَوْقَ صَوْتِ النَّبِيِّ. And Al-Qurtubi narrates from Al-Bukhari, saying, كَادَ الْخَيْرَانِ أَنْ يَحْلَكَا. The two righteous men were about to perish for raising their voices in the presence of the Messenger of God. This is Al-Bukhari. Al-Qurtubi narrates from Al-Bukhari. In Surah An-Nur, Allah is critical of some of the Sahaba who accused one of the wives of the Prophet of zina, of adultery. إِنَّ الَّذِينَ جَاءُوا بِالْإِفْكِ. The story of Ifk is very well known. When the wife of Rasulullah, Aisha, was accused of adultery, Allah mentions the verse and tells us where did this rumor start from? Was it from the Jews? Was it from the Mushrikeen? Was it from the Christians? No. إِنَّ الَّذِينَ جَاءُوا بِالْإِفْكِ عَصْبَةٌ مِّنْكُمْ. Some of you, a group of you that made this story. Or was it made by anyone else? This is in the Quran. In the chapter of Al-Imran, again, going back to the story of Uhud, Allah mentions this verse. Allah questions the faith of some of the Sahaba. Again, not all, some of the Sahaba. وَمَا مُحَمَّدٌ إِلَّا رَسُولٌ قَدْ خَلَتْ مِنْ قَبْلِهِ الرُّسُلُ أَفَإِنْ مَاتَ أَوْ قُتِلَ انقلبتم على أعقابكم. Muhammad is none other than a messenger. Messengers before him have left. If he is killed or he dies, you go back. انقلبتم على أعقابكم. You go back to your old ways. Which old ways? Meaning the days of Jahiliyyah. Meaning going back. Of course, the Quran is not saying that this happened. No. The Quran is not saying that this happened. But the Quran is making the possibility that this could happen. If Sahba, the companionship of Rasulullah, is associated with Asma, with infallibility, that means a Sahabi can never be a disbeliever. But the Quran is saying that if Rasulullah dies, will you go back to being non-believers? That means that it's putting out this possibility. We see several verses in the Quran that talk about munafiqeen. We have an entire chapter called munafiqeen. Who were the munafiqeen? They were definitely not Jews and Christians or mushrikeen. They were people in Medina. The words munafiqun and munafiqeen, these two words, have been mentioned in the Quran at least 26 times. In Surah At-Tawbah, Allah tells us, among the Bedouins around you, there are hypocrites. وَمِنَ الْأَعْرَابِ مُنَافِقُونَ. And among the people of Medina, وَمِنْ أَهْلِ الْمَدِينَةِ مَرَجُوا عَلَى النِّفَاقِ. From the people of Medina, there are hypocrites. Mushrikeen were in Mecca. Jews were outside. Hypocrites were a group different from the Jews and the Christians and the Mushrikeen. They were a different group. They were from among the Quran tells us about some of the Sahaba who would hurt the Prophet emotionally, verbally. They would hurt his feelings. وَمَا كَانَ لَكُمْ أَن تُؤْذُوا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ وَلَا تَنْكِحُوا أَزْوَاجَهُ مِنْ بَعْدِهِ. Al-Wahidi tells us, narrates from Ibn Abbas, that one of the leaders of Quraysh, Al-Wahidi doesn't tell us who. We have other sources that tell us who. For example, Ibn Hadid al-Mu'tazili, he tells us that this was Talha. But Al-Wahidi doesn't say Talha. He says, Ahad Sadat Quraysh. What did he say? He said that if the messenger of God dies, I will marry Aisha. So Allah revealed this verse. This is an Al-Wahidi. Asbab al-Nuzul, Al-Wahidi. These are very harsh and disrespectful words coming from one of the leaders of Quraysh towards Rasulullah. And in fact, if I remember correctly, this was a while back. Ibn Abi al-Hadid al-Mu'tazili in Sharh Nahj al-Balagha, he mentions that when Umar ibn al-Khattab gathered the 6 Sahaba for the Shura, he told Talha, he told him, you were the one that emotionally hurt Rasulullah. And Rasulullah died not pleased with you. This is in Ibn Abi al-Hadid al-Mu'tazili, who was not a Shia, he was a Mu'tazili. We also see that some of the wives of Rasulullah. Now, the wives of Rasulullah were definitely part of the Sahaba because the qualifications of Suhbah apply to the wives of Rasulullah. They met Rasulullah, they lived with Rasulullah, they believed in Rasulullah, and they died with faith. Sahih? These are the qualifications of Suhbah. The wives of Rasulullah were among the Sahaba. We see that in Surah At-Tahrim, in the chapter of Forbiddance, that the Quran is critical of some of the wives of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and has a very harsh tone towards some of the wives of Rasulullah. وَأَسَرَّ النَّبِيُّ إِلَى بَعْضِ أَزْوَاجِهِ حَدِيثًا فَلَمَّا نَبَّأَتْ بِهِ وَأَظْهَرَهُ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ عَرَّفَ بَعْضُهُ وَأَعْرَضَ عَنْ بَعْضٍ فَلَمَّا نَبَّأَهَا بِهِ قَالَتْ مَنْ أَنْبَأَكَ هَذَا. Rasulullah, the Quran briefly tells us about a secret that Rasulullah trusted his wife with. But that wife, she told another wife. Jibreel told Rasulullah that your wife, she told the secret to another one of your wives. She asked him, "Man anba'aka hadha?" Who told you of this? قال أنبأني العليم الخبير. And then, regarding the 2 wives of Rasulullah, Allah says, إن تتوبا إلى الله فقد صغت قلوبكما. If you repent to Allah, your hearts have inclined. At-tawbah is when? At-tawbah is after a ma'siyah, after committing a sin. There's a tawbah. Surely, if Sahba defend, or what's the right word? Ya'sam al-insan, it protects a person from sinning. we see that clearly Allah is telling us that two of the wives of Rasulullah had sinned, because why else would they want? Why else should they say forgiveness? إن تتوبا إلى الله فقد صغت قلوبكما وإن تظاهرا عليه فإن الله هو مولاه وجبريل وصالح المؤمنين. And then listen to these verses. عسى ربه إن طلقكن. If he divorces you, then perhaps and يبدله, Allah will replace him أزواجا خيرا منكم. He will replace him with better wives. Now these are the qualities of the better wives. مسلمات مؤمنات قانتات تائبات عابدات سائحات طيبات وأبكار. Allah will replace him with better wives with such qualities. This is in the Quran. طيب. And then at the end of Surah Al-Tahrim, Allah tells us we have to put two and two together because it's one chapter. Allah tells us the story of two wives, of two prophets. وَضَرَبَ اللَّهُ مَثَلًا لِلَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا امْرَأَةَ نُوحٍ وَامْرَأَةَ لُوطٍ كَانَتَا تَحْتَ عَبْدَيْنِ مِنْ عِبَادِنَا صَالِحَيْنِ. This is a reference to the wives of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. These verses are going together, meaning that if the wife of a prophet does not necessarily have to be perfect. Proof of that is the wife of Lut. Proof of that is the wife of Nuh. This means that the wife of a prophet does not necessarily have to be perfect like her husband. Nor does the wife of a disbeliever have to be a disbeliever like him. وَضَرَبَ اللَّهُ مَثَلًا لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا امْرَأَةَ فِرْعَوْنَ إِذْ قَالَتْ رَبِّ ابْنِ لِي عِندَكَ بَيْتًا فِي الْجَنَّةِ. Thus we have to look carefully at tadabbur in these verses. I leave the commentaries for my dear brothers and sisters. As for what actually happened, I ask my brothers to refer to the sources. What happened between the wives of Rasulullah? And who were those wives? And what exactly happened? This is mentioned in al-Bukhari. Al-Bukhari mentions the story in which Aisha tells us what happened and who those wives were. She says it was me and Hafsa. These are some of the verses that are critical of the Sahaba. I don't know how much time I have. I come to some of the verses that praise the Sahaba. 10 minutes. Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi in his Al-Kifaya mentioned several verses of the Quran that praise all of the Sahaba. Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, he doesn't differentiate between which Sahaba are praised. He says these verses praise all of the Sahaba. And he mentions 6 of these verses, and we will mention them accordingly. The first verse states, والسابقون الأولون من المهاجرين والأنصار والذين تبعوهم بإحسان رضي الله عنهم ورضوا عنه. The early pioneers of the migrants and the helpers and those who followed them in good path, Allah is pleased with them and they are pleased with Him. Clearly this is a verse of praise. We do not deny this. That this is praise for some of the Sahaba without any denial. However, is it all the Sahaba? No, this is not all the Sahaba. The early pioneers. We have to see who were the early pioneers. As-Sabiqun al-Awwalun. When we say the Sahaba, what I listed from Ibn Abdul Barr, Ibn Hajar, when they said that all of the Sahaba were udul, when Rasulullah died, there were over 100,000 of the Sahaba. In Hajjat al-Wada, there were presumably over 100,000. For all of these 100,000, this is praise for all of these 100,000? As-Sabiqun al-Awwalun. Only the pioneering, only the early migrants, not all. So not all of the 100,000. Also, after this verse, immediately comes after وَمِمَّنْ حَوْلَكُمْ مِنَ الْأَعْرَابِ مُنَافِقُونَ وَمِنْ أَهْلِ الْمَدِينَةِ مَرَدُوا عَلَى النِّفَاقِ. The way I see it is that the Quran is speaking about a group of the Sahaba. Some were السابقون الأولون ومن الأعراب منافقون ومن أهل المدينة مردوا على النفاق. The Sahaba were not all the same. There are some that only mention the first verse and do not mention the other verses. This is not correct. We have to look at these verses all together. We are speaking about one group, but divided into various, all of the Sahaba, but divided into various groups. السابقون الأولون ومن الأعراب منافقون ومن أهل المدينة مردوا على النفاق. طيب. The second verse, للفقراء المهاجرين الذين أخرجوا من ديارهم وأموالهم. طيب, this is praise for some of the Sahaba. However, للفقراء المهاجرين, those who have this quality, this is praise for them. Not all of the Muhajirin were poor. Some of them were rich. This does not mean they were bad, but this verse does not apply to them. This verse applies to للفقراء المهاجرين, not to all of the Sahaba. Also, it praises the Ansar. وَالَّذِينَ تَبَوَّأُوا الدَّارَ وَالْإِيمَانَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ يُحِبُّونَ مَنْ هَاجَرَ إِلَيْهِمْ. This is all praise, we accept. But does this mean asma? Does this mean adalah? Does this make them errorless, immaculate? No. They were hospitable, they were generous, they were welcoming to the muhajirin. But does this mean they were immaculate? No. Another verse, كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر. You were the best ummah to come out. They say that this verse is speaking to the Sahaba. This verse is not speaking to the Sahaba. Ibn Kathir in his tafsir testifies that this verse is speaking to the ummah. To the ummah, not just to the Sahaba. كنتم خير أمة. This includes us, me and you. We are part of the ummah. Not just the Sahaba. If it's speaking to the Ummah, are we all udul? Of course we're not all udul. There are many of us that are sinners. Some of us are not righteous. Thus, this verse cannot be saying that all of you are adil, the entire nation is adil. That is not logical. All of us are adil? That is not logical. So the verse is talking about the greater Ummah, not just the Sahaba. Second, even if it is talking about the Sahaba, it has a condition. كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر. The Sahaba who fulfill these conditions, it applies to them. The Sahaba who did not fulfill these conditions, does not apply to them. A fourth verse, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا لِتَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ. Again, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً. It is speaking about the entire ummah, not just the Sahaba. It is not very clear that it's speaking about the Sahaba. This is one. Two, wasata. What does wasata mean? Wasata means you're moderate. You had Christians before you and Jews before you. You are the middle road. You are the moderate road. Does this mean wasata means adalah? It has nothing to do with adalah. لقد رضي الله عن المؤمنين إذ يبايعونك تحت الشجرة. Allah was pleased with the believers when they gave their allegiance to you under the tree. According to Ibn Kathir, that this verse was revealed during the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, Sulh al-Hudaybiyah. How many of the Sahaba were at Sulh al-Hudaybiyah? According to Ibn Kathir, there were either 2,300 or 2,400 or 2,500. And then he picks 2,400. So only some of the Sahaba were present, not all of the Sahaba. Two, this is one. Two, لَقَدْ رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ إِذْ يُبَايِعُونَكَ تَحْتَ الشَّجَرَةِ. Allah was pleased with the believers when they gave their allegiance, meaning He was pleased with them till the day of judgment and forever, or He was pleased with them because they gave their allegiance. This is a big difference. You have a company, and your employee, he does something good. You are pleased with that employee because he did something good. Does that mean that you're going to be pleased with him until the day of judgment? No. You're pleased with him because he did something good. To say that Allah is pleased with them until the day of judgment because of one act, هذا خلاف الله. This is not the apparent meaning of the verse. And thirdly, if that is the meaning, that Allah is pleased with them until the day of judgment, there's a condition. إن الذين يبايعونك إنما يبايعون الله يد الله فوق أيديهم ومن نكث فإنما ينكث على نفسه. And those who take back their allegiance, this is a condition. We have to come and see which of the Sahaba took back the allegiance and who remained true to their allegiance. This is a condition. Ibn Kathir attests to this condition. Also, يا أيها النبي حسبك الله ومن اتبعك من المؤمنين. O you Prophet, God suffices thee and those believers who follow thee. For which mu'mineen? حسبك الله ومن اتبعك من المؤمنين. You say this is praise to all the Sahaba because Allah is calling them mu'mineen, and not just that, but Rasulullah is sufficient because of the Sahaba. Number one, Ibn Abbas narrates that this verse was revealed when Umar ibn Khattab accepted Islam, right? 33 men and 6 women had converted before him. He was the 40th person to convert. God is telling his messenger that now he has sufficient support. If this is true, if we do not contest this narration, this verse is speaking regarding 40 of the Sahaba, not all of the Sahaba, only 40. If this hadith is true. This is one. Two, some of the Mufassirin, some of the Mufassirin, they say that this verse was revealed during the Battle of Badr. The Sahaba who were present at the Battle of Badr, not all of the Sahaba. Three, there are 2 ways to understand this verse. Ya ayyuhan nabi, hasbuka Allah, wa man ittaba'aka min al-mu'minin. Meaning that as long as the Prophet has Allah and the mu'mineen, he is sufficient. Well, this is praise for the mu'mineen, for the Sahaba. And I believe al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, this is what he had in mind. But there's another way to understand the verse. That Allah makes the Prophet and the believers sufficient. Not that the Prophet is sufficient because of Allah and the believers. And this is the correct way of reading the verse. Or at least to say that we don't know mujmal, the verse is mujmal, we don't know which is the correct meaning. Even though we believe it's the second meaning. Muhammadun Rasulullah وَالَّذِينَ مَعَهُ أَشِدَّاءُ عَلَى الْكُفَّارِ وَحَمَاءُ بَيْنَهُم. These are verses of praise. However, several scholars of Tafsir believe that this verse was revealed in Sulh al-Hudaybiyah, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. So again, we have to see who was at Sulh al-Hudaybiyah. Not all of the Sahaba. Sulh al-Hudaybiyah, I believe, was in year 6. Rasulullah died in year 10 or 11. Islam had expanded. A lot of people were added to the Sahaba. This does not include them. We have to see who has these qualities. Muhammad Rasulullah وَالَّذِينَ مَعَهُ أَشِدَّاءُ عَلَى الْكُفَّارِ وَحَمَاءُ بَيْنَهُم. This is praise to those who have these qualities. Those who don't have these qualities, this is not praiseworthy. Finally, at the end of the verse, Allah says, وَعَدَ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ مِنْهُمْ. Those who believe and did good deeds from them. من التبعيض. من تبعيضية. وعد الله الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات منهم مغفرة وأجرا عظيما. Not all of them, some of them. It's in the same exact verse. From all of this, Dr. Khalid, and my dear brothers and sisters, I conclude by saying that we, the followers of Ahlul Bayt, we do not view the Sahaba all on one level. There are some that definitely deserve praise and honor and respect, and they are not restricted just to Salman al-Farisi and Ammar and al-Miqdad and Abu Dhar. These are definitely some of the great Sahaba, but we believe that there were a lot more that deserve respect and honor. Those who died while Rasulullah was alive, those who died in the Battle of Badr and in Uhud and in the other battlegrounds that stood and defended Rasulullah, there were thousands of the Sahaba. Jannat al-Baqi' is filled with many of the Sahaba. We respect them, we honor them. However, according to the Quran, some of them did not deserve respect. Some of them bothered Rasulullah. Some of them emotionally hurt Rasulullah. So we don't see the Sahaba all on one level. We do not believe in Adalah al-Sahaba as a whole. Some of them were udud, some of them were not udud. But as a general principle, we do not accept this principle. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه.